How has the country moved so far from the intentions of its founding fathers? How has the American dream become so distorted?
Over the last 30 or 40 years, capitalism has taken this extreme form. And a lot of it goes back to the economist Milton Friedman from the Chicago School, and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and others buying into these policies that really encourage people to take on huge amounts of debt, encourage privatization, smaller government supposedly, although bigger military, so actually the government spending goes up. Deregulation, getting rid of rules that govern the people who run our institutions, especially our corporations. It's as though we suddenly are supposed to believe that the human beings who sit at the top of corporations don't need to be regulated. They're some sort of gods.
Milton Friedman, his protégés the Chicago Boys, and the neoclassical ideology beat the classical approach to economics and became the framework for what we today call capitalism. There are two main competing economic approaches which determine how we humans manage the world and distribute wealth. These are the classical and neoclassical schools. The classical school favours less government interference, more personal autonomy, and recognises that humans cannot function without natural resources. The neoclassical school, which has a more dismissive view of natural resources, thinks government should rule the economy, solve social problems, and leave the free market to look after the distribution of wealth. The neoclassical school emerged around 100 years ago due to vested interests' desire to protect their assets. This meant that neoclassical mathematical models and assumptions were divorced from reality. They're based on what ought to be, instead of the classical models which are based on what actually is. It's these neoclassical models, which favour large corporations, that have been used to legitimise the financialisation of the global economy. Championed by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, neoclassical economics still dominates policy making today.
The Reagan Revolution, as we call it in the United States, obviously the Reagan-Thatcher Revolution, if you think about it more globally, was a big change in power structure and a big transfer of opportunity and wealth. Now, it's not that the poor gave it to the rich. It was a transfer within the well-to-do, so that the financial sector in particular, in the United States, for example, but also in the UK and some other places, became vastly more profitable, and wages in that sector went up a lot. I mean, we focus on bonuses, but it's also base salaries went up a lot, overall compensation. So there's a transfer from the non-financial part of the economy to the financial part of the economy that actually is unprecedented as far as we can see in any of the available data to us. And I'm talking about all of recorded human history.
In 1932, in the aftermath of America's great stock market crash, a piece of legislation was passed to protect society. The Glass-Steagall Act was introduced to separate ordinary high street banking from investment banking. 67 years later, in 1999, under the influence of Treasury Secretary Larry Summers and his predecessor Robert Rubin, President Bill Clinton repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. Once again, banks could take ordinary depositors' money and speculate with it on virtually anything they liked.
Wall Street has become a very particular type of casino. And it's unfortunately not the kind of casino they have in Las Vegas, which is, perfectly legitimate form of entertainment. It is a casino that has massive negative repercussions on the rest of society. So it's not just losing your money on a few wild nights. It's about the way in which those organizations lose their money, impacting the whole of society, leading to a massive loss of jobs.
This unfettered gambling pushed the entire global financial system to near collapse. With balances and debt obligations larger than the GDP of entire countries, the banks had become too big to fail. The West was unprepared, and bankers met their reeling and disorientated governments.
You have to bail us out. We need money. If you don't give us the money, the whole thing goes down. And what are you going to do with millions and tens of millions of people who have lost everything in their bank account? You will have a revolution on your hands. So fork over the money. borrow the money, create it out of nothing, and give it back to us, and so that we can face our problems and not go under, and or otherwise. And this is what Mr. Hank Paulson did in the U.S. Congress. He went there one day and he told them, well, look, we need $700 billion, and we need it now, or else.
Is this system we call capitalism really capitalism? In a capitalist system, government is supposed to be small, but today the state is more bloated and invasive than it's ever been. Individuals and companies are supposed to operate in a free market. Good enterprise is rewarded with profit, and flawed enterprise with failure. But during the 2008 banking crisis, the people saw the Western economic system divided in a way they were told could never happen.
Socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor. And in America, for example, the banks that got in trouble got bailed out by the government. That's socialism. And people are arguing against socialism in America, and yet it's probably the most socialist country in the world right now.
We have a system which isn't even a proper capitalist system. Rich people make mistakes that they don't get punished. Poor people make mistakes that they get punished. Yeah? Or even worse, that they don't make any mistake and they are forced to pay for the mistakes of the rich.
When the taxpayer is footing the bill for the misplaced speculation of bankers, then suddenly, instead of the economy serving the human being is now in perpetual service to amoral financial organizations. It was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, Alan Greenspan, who after 9/11 slashed interest rates to encourage lending. Bankers needed new participants to keep cash flowing into a system that had become a global pyramid scheme. All this newly created money entered the housing market and created unprecedented inflation. House prices rose and rose. New mothers were forced back into the workplace to service huge home loans, and the Anglo-American dream became all about land speculation.
The housing market in the West isn't about ownership. The housing market in the West, because it's the only way ordinary people can get ahead, and ordinary people can't get ahead but by wages. What we've created is a mass bubble economics around housing. As that sucks in a huge amount of capital, takes capital for genuine innovations in the economy, and puts it into a speculative use that has no genuine productive outcome.
It's interesting, if you talk to people in Germany, for example, they don't see a connection between owning a piece of property and being inclined towards being democratic. There's lots of people who rent their housing there, and they're perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. But it is true that in somewhat different contexts, both Mr. Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher pushed for more people to own housing. And actually, this is part of the problem, because if you push people to buy housing before they're ready, and if you push very dubious loans on them, and they don't understand what they get themselves into, you can have huge adverse repercussions, exactly what led to, in part, the subprime housing crisis in the United States. That's not anything to do with democracy, that's just a bad economic idea.
The breakthrough that occurred around the year 2000 in the United States was when bankers found out that the poor are honest. And they realized that if you're poor, if you're not rich, you have a different set of values. And you think that a debt is a debt, and it's something that has to be paid. And the people will try to pay the debts that they're stuck with, even if the debts are not valid, even if the debts are much more than they expected, even if they really can't pay the debts.
The lending and banking institutions, when they drew up contracts with interest rates, with flexible interest rates, I think they knew in the beginning that these problems were going to come back later on, where folks weren't going to be able to afford the mortgages as the interest rates increased. It put a lot of people in situations where they were taking food out of refrigerators, taking kids out of higher education. They're not able to afford college anymore. And it is making a really, really bad situation worse.
The banks engaged in what was a criminal conspiracy to charge more to the blacks and Hispanics. The banks got together, backed the Bush administration to block the state prosecutions of racial lending in order to exploit and charge more to the minorities.
These are loans which were made by one of the major lenders in the city and in this country, Wells Fargo, in which Wells Fargo targeted minority communities in the city, put borrowers into loans that they could not afford, put borrowers into loans that were of the subprime variety, therefore more expensive and less advantageous to the borrowers.
Hiding predatory lending practices in the small print of complex financial products was only ever going to enrich one set of interests.
Many of the communities in which African Americans live in the city were establishing momentum. There was development activity that was occurring. We were seeing signs of vitality in many of these communities, and the results of the Wells Fargo foreclosures and the subprime lending practices of that lender and others has significantly impaired that progress and brought it to a halt.
They're not worrying about, they don't come in the heart of it. Like you in the heart of it, so you see. They don't really see the struggle if they don't come in the heart of it. They see the outside of it. That's like looking at the cover of a book and seeing the outside of a book, but if you don't go inside the book, then you'll never know what the book about. So they're not worrying about nobody else but themselves. And I think it's wrong, because if they come in the heart of it and they see it, they'll be willing to help.
What happened in Baltimore is just one example of what is happening all around the world. One way to frame this injustice is by branding it a race issue. But when we look really closely, we can see that there is something at play here that transcends race: profit.
Not an accident, for instance, that we had the deregulation in our financial industry that was such a disaster. The lobbyists of the finance industry amount to 5 per congressperson. In other words, they pay 5 people for every congressman to explain to them, persuade them, that they should pass legislation that is favorable to the financial industry. The poor people who are devastated don't have the money. They couldn't hire 5 per congressman. So the way our democracy works, it's an unlevel playing field.
The financial sector has acquired enormous power, partly through political contributions, so buying favors, but mostly through ideological control, convincing people that finance is good, more finance is better, and unregulated finance without limit is best. And that is really the cornerstone of this, what we call in the United States, the Wall Street-Washington corridor.
I mean, if people need any proof as to who's controlling Washington, when the bailout came after Lehman Brothers collapsed, 80% of the population was against the bailout. Notwithstanding that, Congress passed the bailout, just showing, in my view anyway, that it's really under the control of banking interests.
It's not a reflection of good democracy when a company, a group of companies, an industry, says our interests are more important than the national interest. How can that happen? Very easy. That's the role of campaign contributions, lobbying, in America's political structure. We have a flawed democracy.
This is an advanced oligarchy in the sense that its main mechanism of control, if you like, is through convincing people that you really need, for example, the 6 biggest banks in the United States in the particular form they exist today, with the very light level of regulation. And if you don't have them, if you try to change that, all kinds of awful things will happen. And this is not really blackmail. I mean, it sounds like blackmail, but they convince you it's not blackmail, it's just that's the way the world is. There's nothing you can do about it. Oh my goodness, you just have to cooperate with them. It's very clever.
The Fed is essentially the lobbyist for the commercial banking system. When you say you want to turn regulation over to the Fed, you're saying the financial sector and Wall Street should be self-regulated. And the Wall Street has veto power over whoever is going to be the head of the Federal Reserve. As long as you give veto power over the regulators to Wall Street, as long as you pick the bank regulators from the banking industry itself, you can forget any thought of calling it regulation. It's deregulation, and to call it regulation instead of deregulation is using Orwellian doublethink.
Democracy is government by the people. Plutocracy is government by the rich. In a typical plutocratic state, economic inequality is high, social mobility low, and because of continuous exploitation of the masses, workers find it nearly impossible to climb out of poverty. The equal voting rights movement in the early 20th century abolished a system where rich people had more votes than poor people. But today, lobbying has put pay to that and reduced the American political system to a mere clearinghouse for the concerns of the rich.
The Goldman Sachs machine is one of using profits to buy influence in Washington to change laws to make it easier to make money on Wall Street to be used to buy influence in Washington. So it's a self-reinforcing malfeasance machine that is continuing to grow as a parasite in the economy and continuing to kill the host.
Famous for claiming it did God's work, Goldman Sachs is one of the most influential investment banks in the world. Its alumni often occupy positions of great influence in governments and central banks. In September 2008, barely a month before the stock market crash, Goldman, supposedly a pillar of the free market, changed its banking status from investment to commercial. This meant it was now eligible for state protection. Socialism for the rich, right there.
Goldman Sachs are extremely efficient at what they do. Their task is to make money. They make bank robbers like Willie Sutton look like modest amateurs. They're huge bank robbers, but it's legal. The system is set up so that they can do it. In the recent years, they've been selling securities put together from mortgages that they knew were worthless. So they're selling these things to unwitting consumers, making a ton of money on it. Meanwhile, they're betting that they're going to fail because they know that what they're peddling is rotten. So they placed bets with it's called credit default swaps and other things with a huge insurance company, AIG, and that was insuring Goldman Sachs against the failure of the stuff they're peddling.
During America's subprime collapse, Goldman traders Michael Swenson and Josh Birnbaum made a $4 billion profit by short-selling junk mortgages. Backed by Dan Sparks, internally Goldman Sachs called their position the Big Short and bet against their own clients. Senator Carl Levin called Goldman Sachs chief executive Lloyd Blankfein to a Senate subcommittee to testify under oath.
Much has been said about the supposedly massive short Goldman Sachs had on the U.S. housing market. The fact is, we were not consistently or significantly net short the market in residential mortgage-related products in 2007 and 2008. We didn't have a massive short against the housing market, and we certainly did not bet against our clients.
Riding the Big Short in 2007 made billions of dollars for Goldman. And so far, they've got away scot-free with this massive heist.
So they're now back bigger than before, richer than before, biggest profits they've had in history, huge bonuses. They're doing great. A lot of what they're doing has, in fact, probably maybe all of it, has almost nothing to do with the benefit of the economy.
Can there be any objection to genuinely talented people earning big money if they bring something new and tangible to the world? If they take great personal risks with their own money and actually bring greater prosperity for all?
In a free market, if I have a brilliant idea that I can run an automobile on grass clippings, as an example, and I produce that car, my motivation might be to make money. But if the market says, my goodness, this is the greatest automobile ever invented by mankind, and I make $1 billion, I've not only served myself, but I have served everyone else that needs transportation. And that is the brilliance of a free market, is that paradox that you can serve yourself and simultaneously serve others. And that's what it's all about.
But how many of the general public have achieved greater prosperity through a banker's bonus? It was against the holy backdrop of St. Paul's Cathedral in London that Goldman Sachs vice chairman and mouthpiece Lord Griffiths gave insight into how certain bankers really think. The devoted Christian defended extortionate bonuses.
I'm not a person of despair, I'm a person of hope. And I think that we have to tolerate the inequality as a way to achieving greater prosperity and opportunity for all.
The fundamental Christian view, and I would say of Islam as well, and certainly of Judaism, is that wealth is to be shared. Money has to be shared. You can't take it with you. And from that develops a whole lot of stuff about justice and the economy and so on. And we've lost that, and instead we've got people accumulating more and more. And I just think it's disgusting that people have lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they can't pay their mortgages from bankers who made a big mistake and then paid enormous bonuses. I'm sorry, that is simply wrong. And I can't understand why we are not more vociferous about that.
When rich people tell you that they specifically have to be rich through these egregious rip-off mechanisms, that's just self-serving propaganda and it should be disregarded. It is true that when you organize human society, some people get ahead and some people struggle. That's a natural mechanism. But saying, oh, we've got to have inequality, therefore Goldman Sachs must be organized along the following lines, that's a complete non sequitur.
At what juncture, at what point does morality enter into the economic calculus? In a way, many people think that Adam Smith gave us a free pass, a way not to think about morality. Because what Adam Smith said was that individuals in the pursuit of their self-interest are led as if by an invisible hand to the general well-being of society. Now let me make it clear, Adam Smith didn't really say that. That is to say, Adam Smith was very much aware that businesses, when they got together, conspired against the public interest, raised prices. He was aware of monopoly. He was aware of the importance of education that the private sector couldn't provide. So he himself was aware of all the limitations, but his latter-day descendants have forgotten all those caveats.
Adam Smith was the godfather of classical economics, but since its publication, his work has been used as a political football, financiers twisting his words to suit them. Lord Griffiths advocates ruthless individualism to push this idea that if bankers get rich, then we get rich too, through a process known as trickle-down economics, or horse and sparrow theory. If you feed the horse enough oats, some will pass through to the road for the sparrows. The idea is that extreme wealth concentrated on a small minority will eventually trickle down to everyone else. But it doesn't work. Because by the time the money reaches the people at the bottom of our money pyramid, it's lost its purchasing power. But the public are now confused as to why our political leaders have allowed this to happen, and quite naturally now ask why.
Because our political processes are badly flawed. They're badly flawed because of the dependence on lobbyists, on campaign contributions. So that's why, my view, and a view I think of a lot of people, is that we have to restructure our political processes to give more voice to the ordinary citizen and less voice to the interest group, to the moneyed groups, to those who have taken such a large role in shaping our tax code, our regulatory regulations, and so forth.
I stood on the front step of Colin Powell's house, and I look at him and say, what next, boss? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, what next? Where are you going next? I'm going to write my book. I said, no, I know you're going to write your book, but you're not going to do that for the rest of your life. Where are you going next? He said, maybe a cabinet position, but first, money. I said, money? He said, yeah, millions. That's the only way you can be a cabinet officer in the American government. Oh, wow. The Democrats and the Republicans are beholden to corporate interests, and until they become unbeholden to those corporate interests, we will never have a well-governed republic.
Welcome back to New World Next Week. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com.
And I'm James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com. Did you guys catch Jon Stewart's blistering critique of the Trans-Pacific Partnership? No. That's because he's never mentioned it, and that's why dinosaur media is going down as the alt media continues to rise, and will keep covering the stories that the via Comcast-controlled mouthpieces mustn't talk about. Let's begin this episode 220 of the New World Next Week with negotiators helping the TPP get even worse by caving on copyright term extensions. This via the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF.org. New reports indicate that Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP negotiators have agreed to language that would bind its 12 signatory nations to extend copyright terms to match the United States' already excessive length of copyright. This provision expands the reach of the controversial U.S. Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, or the Mickey Mouse Act, as it was called due to Disney's heavy lobbying, to countries of the Pacific region. Nations including Japan, New Zealand, Malaysia, and Canada would all be required to extend their terms and grant big content companies lengthy exclusive rights to works for no empirical reason. This means that all of the TPP's extreme enforcement provisions would apply to creative works for up to, or rather upwards of 100 years. Negotiators have been made well aware that there is no economic rationale that can justify this extension for all of those Pacific nations. The fact that they've chosen to ignore what is, of course, a clear consensus among economists points to the fact that this agreement hasn't been driven by reason, but by the utter corruption of the process by lobbyists for multinational entertainment conglomerates who have twisted what is notionally a trade negotiation into a special interest money grab. Even as excessive copyright fails to even accomplish its aims, it creates a whole host of other problems. It would force everyone living in TPP signatory countries to pay a heavy price in continued royalties for content. The White House justifies the TPP by claiming it will promote economic growth and create jobs, but the continued enclosure of culture under exorbitant copyright terms would have the opposite effect. The copyright term extension provisions in the Trans-Pacific Partnership embody everything that's wrong with the TPP's digital policy rules, namely that those rules are put there for and by the corporate interests that are privy to these secret negotiations at the expense of users and the public interest. Now, James, I feel compelled to note again, as a mainstream media charade is playing out right now here in the States, that this is precisely the kind of news that Brian Williams or Jon Stewart have not and will not report on. We've been covering the TPP on New World Next Week since at least 2013, and even in 2012, Slate called the TPP, quote, the most important trade agreement that we know nothing about. And I would say the very reason many people know nothing about the TPP is because those most trusted newsmen are fronts for the very same multinational corporations that, well, you know, James.
Yeah, exactly right. And let me bid a fond farewell to, or an unfond farewell to Brian Williams and John Leibowitz. Let's never forget, Stewart is just the stage name. And yes, exactly, they will always avoid these types of issues. So let's delve into these issues here, and I hope that people will go and click through that EFF link that we have in the show notes about this story, because they have that link to the PDF demonstrating that there is absolutely no even imaginable economic benefit to this copyright extension. And just reading from the Hargreaves report that they quote in that PDF, economic evidence is clear that the likely deadweight loss to the economy exceeds any additional incentivizing effect which might result from the extension of copyright term beyond its present levels. This is doubly clear for retrospective extension to copyright term, given the impossibility of incentivizing the creation of already existing works or work from artists already dead. So exactly right. They're not even, I mean, there's not even an argument to be made that this has any economic benefit, on top of the fact that, as I hope my listeners will be aware, intellectual property doesn't exist. It doesn't exist anywhere except in the courts. It's not something that arises from natural law. There's no natural rights argument for intellectual property. There's nothing in nature that says I can't play a chord this way on the guitar, followed by this chord, followed by this chord. It's a completely artificial construction that, of course, is only there to incentivize and to provide economic benefits to corporations like Disney, of course. Every time Mickey Mouse is due to come into the public domain, there you go, it's suddenly extended. So yes, this is absolutely just another nail in the coffin of what the TPP represents and what all of these trade deals represent. And the insidious part of this, of course, is that it's being done behind the scenes. And interestingly, I just got an email from a user, Richard, who emailed me to say that eBay just sent him an email asking him to send a letter to his member of Congress lobbying for supporting small business trade online. And they make it sound like this e-commerce thing that they're trying to go for. But what they are actually trying to get people to do is to write to badger their congressman to pass the Trade Promotion Authority and Customs Reauthorization. I'll throw in an FAS.org link about this, but basically this is the bill under which Congress gives and cedes a lot of its authority over to the president to go and do these types of behind-the-scenes negotiations. And, of course, eBay and all the other big-name players in this want this type of legislation passed so that the president can do these secret negotiations, so that these trade deals can be passed. It is a complex and disgusting web. We'll throw the links in the show notes so you can go and start piecing it together. But surprise, surprise, these trade deals are absolutely designed to not benefit you in any way, shape, or form, only to hurt and hinder you. And so that's why these must be opposed. And that's why the people who will not talk about them must be exposed.
Mm-hmm. And the president that you mentioned is the guy who just went on television and noted, well, sometimes we have to twist countries' arms to get them to do what we want to do. So replace countries with corporations, as the corporations mostly have, and you get a lot of truth coming out, James. And I think a lot of the things that we tried to put on the record with the New World Next Year 2015 episode, I think as we're looking at them as 2015 rolls on, the trade deals, the exposure of corrupt so-called leaders, I think continues apace. And that EFF article, as you know, it does have a lot of great info in there. I just kept to the main points germane to this episode. But again, in all the cases, follow the links, go do more research for yourself. James, our second story this week comes from globalresearch.ca, an article written by M. Oliver Haydorn, The Case to Reinstate the Bank of Canada. There's a really interesting legal case playing out in Canada at the moment where concerned citizens and a group called the Committee for Monetary and Economic Reform filed a lawsuit back in December 2011 in federal court to try and force a restoration of the Bank of Canada to its mandated purposes. In essence, they want the Bank of Canada to provide interest-free loans to the federal, provincial, and municipal governments as provided for in the Bank of Canada Act. This money would be used to finance public expenditures whenever there's a budgetary deficit. Apparently, the federal government used to borrow interest-free, to at least some extent, from the Bank of Canada up until 1974. But at present, governments borrow all of the necessary money, apart from any bonds they might sell to the public, from private banks at the going rate of interest. Canadians are economically burdened with the resultant debt servicing charges because the Bank of Canada does not make use of its prerogatives in the interest of the Canadian public. Their case is being prosecuted by Rocco Galati, who's widely considered to be Canada's top constitutional lawyer. So we can break a lot of this down, and the lawsuit has been explained on our man Dan Dick's website, pressfortruth.ca, in the following terms. Two Canadians and a Canadian economic think tank confront the global financial powers in the Canadian federal court. The Canadians plead for declarations that would restore the use of the Bank of Canada for the benefit of Canadians and remove it from the control of international private entities whose interests and directives are placed above the interest of Canadians and the primacy of the Constitution of Canada. Now, James, this sounds a hell of a lot like the same situation we kind of have here in the States, where a Federal Reserve loans all of the money to the Congress, despite the fact Congress has the constitutional right and duty to print the money, right, James?
Well, yes, it's functioning in the same way, but the Bank of Canada is actually a different beast entirely, because the Federal Reserve was created specifically as this private banking cartel, and that's what it is at its core. The Bank of Canada is actually a public utility. It's just not being used that way. The private banks are making the money as debt money. So this is important because at the very least, this does offer Canadians a way into the conversation about monetary reform and what type of monetary system we want in the first place. But you mentioned Dan Dixon, Press for Truth, who've been doing the yeoman's work on this for the last 4 years since this lawsuit was first kicked off. And I will direct people to his most recent video on this, Comer versus the Bank of Canada, where he lays this out, I think, in the exact terms that I would, which is to say, it's a good thing that this is happening. It's a good thing it's proceeding, and however this eventuates. And let's keep this in perspective. All that's been granted is the ability for this lawsuit to go ahead. I mean, nothing's been won at this point. So let's temper our happiness at this point. But still, having said that, even if this goes ahead, and even if it does go through, and the Bank of Canada is used to issue debt-free money to the government again, is that really ultimately what we want? Is that the be-all and end-all of this situation? And I would answer, as Dan, I think, points out it with a lot of detail in his video, the answer is not really. I mean, it would be better than having the banksters directly controlling the money supply, but it's not that much better, unless you believe that a Harper or a Justin Trudeau or whoever is the next goon to get into political office is going to be a better steward of the public trust than the banksters. They are just puppets of the banksters, and the idea that this is going to be used solely for good, infrastructure projects and sunshine and rainbows and puppy dogs, and the politicians will be very clear and very, very careful not to create inflation. They'll be very good about that, right? Of course not. It will just be a big meal ticket for whatever politician can offer the public the most out of this money from nothing. So I think the real answer is, as always, a truly free competition in currencies. Why is the Bank of Canada the one that gets to determine the monetary reality for the country? Why isn't it left up to everyone to compete equally? And why do we have these laws that determine what currency really is? So I think that's the deeper issue. Again, I'll throw people to Dan Dix for that examination, and hopefully I will be getting an interview on this from someone involved with the lawsuit sometime in the near future. Back when this started in 2011, I tried to get anyone to do an interview about this, and no one ever responded to me. So hopefully I've got a lead this time, so I hope this will turn out differently, but we'll see. Anyway, if anyone is out there who has any contact with Comer or these people, please get them in touch with me and we'll set something up, and we'll see where it goes from here. So again, I think this is an important window into the monetary reform conversation for Canadians, so at least let's use it for that and get the word out about this issue and how it affects the average Canadian. $20 billion a year in interest paid to the money that's being loaned to the Canadian government that doesn't need to have interest on it at all.
James, let's throw in one other economic note on this story, too, on this New World Next Week. HSBC tax dodge revelations are just the tip of the iceberg, as the AFP reports. The former HSBC employee who leaked sensational secret documents alleging the bank helped wealthy customers dodge millions of dollars in taxes warned just the other day that the revelations are just the tip of the iceberg. But let's move to our third and final story this week as we continue our work in 2015 to bring you some good news. And you are invited to contribute to that conversation using hashtag #GoodNewsNextWeek on Twitter. And we'll take this one, James, from althealthworks.com. Moms crash Monsanto shareholder meeting and pass share owner proxy access resolution. I'm imploring you to choose a new direction, said Zen Honeycutt, founder of Moms Across America, at Monsanto's headquarters on January 30th. Stop poisoning our children. Honeycutt spoke at the Monsanto shareholders meeting in St. Louis as part of a rally at the company's world headquarters, along with Organic Consumers Association, Some of Us, an economic advocacy organization for citizens over corporations, and, of course, Moms Across America supporters from across America. Their aim was to educate Monsanto shareholders and the executives on the stunning health consequences of their chemical and GMO seed giant products, as well as to ask for shareholder support for what was called item number 5. That's share owner proxy access. The Moms Across America website calls that an essential mechanism for accountability supported by institutional investors and the SEC. Now, James, it's not often I have to go to the Wall Street Journal to kind of suss out a situation, but they have an article, Monsanto shareholders approve non-binding proxy access proposal. So in doing a little more research in this, James, and searching proxy access, one of the main stories that seems to come up is SEC okays Whole Foods proxy access proposal, meaning that, again, I think the food revolution is winning, and we can see it in these kind of evasive maneuvers by big food. So what this proxy access does is basically put someone who might not agree with the company line on the board. And non-binding, of course, we see that a lot of times. But I think, again, this kind of shows they're having to bend in a lot of ways because they know we're finding out about what's going on, and they know that we're making changes to our lives. James, you found this good news story. Tell me your thoughts on it.
Well, I think that the way you phrase it there is important. It is like bending these corporations slowly towards our will, and it can work, as it has for example, taking the bovine growth hormone largely out of the dairy milk and things like that. It can work in little ways, exerting a lot of pressure on little pressure points to bend corporations in ways that will hopefully at least make them somewhat more palatable. Obviously, what we want is Monsanto to shatter into a million pieces and those pieces to be scattered to the winds, but unlike Hollywood movies, that's unlikely to eventuate. The way this will work is a million activists exerting power on a million different pressure points to get this, to at the very least, to educate the public about what's going on so they can avoid the corporation entirely, which I think is the real way to get rid of these corporations. But anyway, my hat's off to Zen Honeycutt for doing this, and again, 99% of activism is action, so anyone getting off their butt and actually doing something like crashing a shareholders meeting and arguing in favor of this proxy access, that's something. That is something, and I do applaud people for doing that. Is it going to end Monsanto tomorrow? No. But is it going to do something towards, at the very, very least, again, educating the public and getting more awareness, and also making sure that the shareholders realize they're not living in a little bubble. They are actually part of this corporation that is a behemoth and that is violently, or not violently, but viciously opposed by many people around the world. And so, again, it's like confronting politicians, we are change style or whatever. Is it going to change those politicians and what they're doing? Probably not. But at any rate, it makes them aware that they're not living in a little reality bubble, that they can do whatever they want with impunity. And it also helps to educate the public while we're at it. So again, my hat's off to anyone doing this type of action.
And they are doing this type of action. Let's throw in a couple of other good news notes and noting people taking action, like Bo in Iowa, who had his letter to the editor published in his local paper about water fluoridation. And he tweeted us to let us know that his letter was published, and he feels that excitement. You go, oh my God, this actually does something, and you're taking part, and you see that it's not always some brick wall that you can't break through, that a lot of times, again, the media will take a press release if you send it to them. Meanwhile, just as you noted, James, and one of the latest developments in this, Breyers ice cream, big ice cream here in America, drops milk tainted with Monsanto's RBST. And a little bit of other good green news, Colorado may refund millions of dollars to Coloradans in weed taxes because they're making way more money than they ever even thought they would once they actually let a plant grow from the earth and use it to build and grow things. The other sort of related or unrelated, rather, stories we'll cover with hashtag New World next week that, again, all the other amazing audience members and listeners and folks out there submit to us because we couldn't keep up with all of it. But it is important to note that the inevitable war with ISIS has finally been declared in some ways. Again, we find the phony left completely complicit in more war of aggressions under their phony Nobel Prince of Peace Prize. Meanwhile, Ukrainians rage against the military draft, and Samsung's smart TV allows spying on its users. So basically, you can be spied and lied to, or you can not hate the media and become the media, James.
That's pretty much it. I think that's it for this week, unless you have anything else to add.
That's it, man. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Take care. Talk to you next week.